Here we go. Thanks for the introduction. Can you hear me? Is it okay? All right. So I know why everyone looks very happy today. The iPhone, the new iPhone has come out. And interesting enough, I received an email last night from, doesn't matter who, that this person is in Iran, that apparently he's going to buy the iPhone today in Iran. How he's going to do it, I do not know. But I do know one thing, that the smartphone technology, and in fact that the culture goes with it, is growing in a rapid pace in Iran. There is no empirical evidence. I do not have any, because really doing research on these kind of things in Iran is a bit difficult, especially if you're coming outside of Iran. But what we do know is that it's kind of a status thing if you own an iPhone or if you have an iPad, and you could be still coming from a low-class economic background, still you could try your best to own an iPhone. And with that, of course, there's a culture in which requires people like us to study, investigate, and understand. Now, I bring this thing up, this Manoto channel. This is a satellite channel in Iran. I bring it up because there's actually, there is a program in this channel. I think it shows the program is on Tuesday or Wednesday. Explicitly is on smartphones. So, it talks about a lot of things, including different kind of technology, but specifically on iPhones. And he explains and describes, for instance, the difference between iPhone and Android. And he shows you the different apps you could download. It's a fascinating show. And this show particularly is designed for an Iranian audience based, of course, in Iran. Now, I bring all of this up because I really want to talk about Manoto. Manoto is a fascinating satellite channel in Iran. It's hip, it's funky, and the people that organize and basically participated in it are really young people with really cool hairstyles. And there's one guy, his hair is really cool. He comes, well, anyway, I have to show you the picture if I had one. But Manoto is famous for his documentaries in Iran. This one particular documentary is about Farah, the former Iranian queen. And there are a bunch of different documentaries, but this one is very famous. In fact, right now, I think the third season just started. It's called the Gugush Academy. I think it's modeled after the Arab, I think, what's the Arab Academy? I forget, Marwan. What was the name of the musical contest? Star Academy, sorry. It's possibly modeled after that, but it's also modeled most likely based on the British music academies or the contest, and also the American Idol. You could basically sign up by going on Facebook, and you could show your picture or your video on Facebook, and then eventually you get picked and you could compete in this contest. Gugush, of course, is a famous Iranian, pre-revolution Iranian diva. She's famous for her songs and music, and she's probably one of the owners of the corporation who's actually running Manoto as a channel. Now, there are different shows in this satellite channel. Why Not is one. This one particular Iranian lady shows up and does different kind of jobs. She purposely goes and, I don't know, becomes a surfer. And the show is 30 minutes long, but nevertheless, it's very popular in Iran. This is another one, Welcome to Dinner. This is huge. This is huge. And according to Manoto's website, he has around like 5 or 6 million followers in Iran who watch this show. But we do know one thing, given the fact we don't have empirical evidence, that this shows that Manoto is producing, is somehow reproducing or actually seeing a reaction of it in the Iranian pop culture. This is another one. This is actually Iranian-produced Manoto, kind of a dinner competition show, which 4 people get together and they compete and they talk. Of course, the much of the content of this show is about trying to say that really Manoto is foreign-based, is not truly authentically Iranian. But and at the same time, my understanding is that there's a lot of popular interest in this show in Iran. There's also something interesting I should note, that Manoto's pop cultural artifacts, some of the themes and programs and sometimes discourses that are used in the channels, they're somehow kind of slipping over and coming into Iranian popular cultural practices. So this one is a popular theater show in northern part of Tehran, and I attended this show just for fun, and I was surprised to see how many references were made to Manoto channel. There's another show, Dr. Copy, which makes fun of Iranian politicians and also non-Iranian politicians. The reference to monkey is interesting. One theory is that the monkey is reference to the Iranian president Ahmadinejad, but that's a different story. More importantly is Otaq Khabar, the newsroom. And this is, we are talking about 4 or 5 people, journalists, most likely coming from Iran, former journalists in Iran, who have now come to UK and they're participating in Manoto channel, and they basically report. But the reporting is very unique. They talk to each other, they do not talk to the camera, and they also use very much social media and incorporate it into their news. Channel 3 State TV of Iran actually has a YouTube clip. I decided not to put it, it's a bit long, and it kind of makes a mockery of that show, which is interesting, and it shows that probably the news channel has an audience, and the Iranian, perhaps, State TV is trying to counter affect that and trying to produce something, or at least making fun of it. According to this new report that was published recently, and I think it's a very good work, it's one of the only instances that we have actual empirical evidence of how Iranians are looking at news in Iran. It argues that, in fact, new channels like Manoto are not very popular in Iran with regards to getting the news. There's, of course, the Iran State TV, there's BBC Persia, which has a lot of followers, but when it comes to channels like Manoto, Iranians do not get much of their news from these channels. And of course, there's a methodological challenge here. How do you ask people questions about whether you could watch these things, given the fact these channels are illegal within Iran? My hunch is that satellite TV perhaps probably has a lot more audience, especially when it comes to news. That's one thing. A second thing is that most likely the way these Iranian audiences are getting the news from these different satellite channels is not from the Otaq Khabar or the newsroom I just gave you, but other programs in which include a lot of news within this particular channel that I just showed you. Let me just go back quickly to this. I just give you a brief history. Satellite TV started in early 1990s in Iran, very much like in the other parts of the so-called developing world. 1995, the threat was so much that the Iranian government decided to ban it, ban mostly selling and using satellite TV. Ultimately, in late 1990s and 2000s, with the improvements in analog broadcasting, we see a kind of improved quality of satellite channels. And then, of course, with that came an increased number of channels. So from 2000s onwards, probably 2000 and 2001 onwards, we're seeing better quality satellite channels in Iran. Sorry, people watching this in Iran who are watching these different channels being broadcast outside of Iran. VOA, of course, is a good example. There are number of these pro-monarchist channels based in Los Angeles, and the one to the top left is a good example of it. And they're very sensationalist and they're very political. BBC Persia appeared, I think it was launched in 2008, and he appeared in early 2009, just a few months before the elections, and immediately it was a huge popular show. And of course, there are other shows here that I just need to mention. There's PMC, GEM TV. And recently, these different channels are also including certain news sections in their own programs, which is also interesting to note. But the most important one, I would say, right up with Manoto, which is very popular in Iran, is Farsi One. Farsi One is partly owned by Moby Dick. This is an Afghan corporation based in Dubai, and also a news corporation. Mr. Murdoch is everywhere. He's also in Iran, or at least involved in the Iranian media public landscape. But this Farsi One was huge, and still is huge. But it's famous for showing really cool, interesting shows, mostly from Telemundo, based in Puerto Rico and Florida, and also different Spanish-speaking shows, soap operas. The Body of Desire is a famous one. There's Salvador, the very good-looking Salvador, who many Iranians, Iranian women, fell in love with him when the show started to be screened back in 2010. I bring this up because I want to really emphasize the point how much this so-called pop culture aspect is influencing Iranian everyday life. The way these different images are somehow being, you could find them in your mobile texting, messaging, you could find these images and different jokes and different pop cultural dimensions in everyday Iranian life. Now, Manoto came in 2010. That's really the year that Manoto emerged as a satellite channel. And of course, this one at first, people were apprehensive, but it kind of picked up and it became huge. In 2011, Manoto very much tried to use social media in order to grow its audience, and it did a really good job. I gave an example of Gugush Music Academy. There are a number of different shows here as well. And by the way, Manoto has a Facebook site. Let me go with it. The most interesting show, and I really want to highlight this in order to start my conversation and today's presentation, is this show called Sally Talk. Sally Talk is fascinating. I think it was launched in 2011, and it's basically this very, nice-looking young lady who talks about certain social and political aspect of Iranian society, but it does that by actually using videos that are being sent from Iran by ordinary Iranians to the Facebook site. So Manoto organizers for this particular show, they pick up the best ones, the most interesting ones, and they include everything. They could include someone who's opening up a milk box, and next thing they find orange juice in it, all the way to interesting stuff that is happening with Iranian traffic, you name it. And all of that, of course, is about social commentary. Social commentary by video taping or recording the stuff that is happening everyday life of Iranian society, putting it, uploading it in Facebook and sometimes YouTube, and then sending it to Manoto, and eventually you're finding it in satellite channel. You find Iranian Iranian characters who are based in Iran who are actually appearing in satellite channel. The fascinating interconnection here is I think, is something to bear in mind, because it will come to play a major role, I think, in this particular kind of reporting, when things get a bit political. This one particular is very interesting. You see, we're talking about transparency. Someone has taken a picture of an Iranian reporter from the state TV who's getting an interview, and she's basically telling him what to say. That picture is on Manoto's, the Sally Talks Facebook site, and I have seen that picture in the satellite TV channel while I was in Iran a few weeks ago. This tells us something very interesting, and I think the most interesting one is this particular example I have here. Shahr-e is the southernmost part of the city of Tehran, the capital city of Iran. Shahr-e is probably one of the most quote-unquote traditional parts of the Tehranian city. It's one of those places that, at least in the Iranian context, you would understand to be authentic Iran. This is the place you will find really old houses, but also you find a lot of poor people. Just a few weeks ago, and that's my understanding, I have to do more research on this, the city of Tehran, the mayor decided to kick out Shahr-e from the Tehran metropolis. Now, why that was done, I do not know. I have to do research. But my understanding that it has a lot to do with finances, and they decided to make a city of its own, Shahr-e, and that angered a lot of people. Some of the people that were angered, there were lots of young people, and these young people decided to create iReports about this. And they actually had an iReport of the way in which the city was broken away, Shahr-e was broken away from the city of Tehran. And they showed, it's interesting, these young reporters from Iran, from the city, they showed these different kind of clips from the way in which these various people were actually objecting to this policy by the Tehran city mayors. And they were actually posting this and showing these different clips on Manoto. The reporter's face was blurred, so you couldn't see it, but nevertheless, something fascinating was going on. My understanding is that that reporter was not paid. And this is the city of Tehran. We're talking about the southernmost part of the city. That reporter's face was blurred. But what's also interesting in this particular report that I saw in Iran is that the reporter would go at night, and he would go, or at least his crew, they would go and record all these different graffitis against the city's decision to kick Shahr-e out of the Tehran metropolis. This is one example. This is actually not an example of the Shahrareh case, but it really shows how much graffiti culture, especially at night, people going in the streets and making these graffitis plays a role in Iran's everyday life, but the way in which also these graffitis are finding themselves their way in social media and sometimes getting reported in satellite TV channels like Manoto. This particular graffiti says that, I think, how would I translate this? The rights of woman, hijab ikhtiyar haq zani Iran. How do you translate that?
It is the right of the women to wear or not wear.
Thank you. It's the right of women to wear or not wear the hijab or the Islamic scarf. I have seen some of the peoples that make these graffitis, by the way. Let me go back. And these things are mostly done at nights, because that's the time that, of course, they're not visibly seen. I'm going to talk about the night culture later on. But I do want to emphasize this, and this is a good way of opening up the discussion or the presentations today, that look, social media, at least in the Iranian context, and we could talk about different social contexts around the globe, it's been used for specific civic engagements. In particular, I have in my mind the reference to the post-election era. The case of Neda is famous. I do not have time to go too much in detail how internet was used during the election and post-election period in 2009. But the case of Neda is fascinating because that clip, first and foremost, was recorded on a cell phone and immediately was put on Facebook. Then it went to YouTube, and after that, it went to Al Jazeera and CNN. The fascinating circulation from the so-called new media to old media in this case is really something that we need to make a note of, because it kind of breaks down barriers between the so-called old and new media, and it shows the interactivity between these different medias, at least in the case of the post-election Iran. Now, this is how I would understand or describe civic activism, at least in the Iranian context. These examples I just gave, the most perhaps benign one, showing pictures of a reporter, that picture you saw, all the way to Neda's case, where you actually saw a major social movement that is challenging state authority. I see these different civic activism as forms of contentious performances, but these are kind of contentious performances that are very much associated with the use of internet and, of course, other new information communication technologies. So I do not separate contentious performances in the Iranian context from the so-called new media technologies. Now, the second point is this. Social media, in particular networking sites like Facebook, and there are other ones too, there are also Persian-speaking websites like Balatarin, are opening up new forms of contentious activities in changing the way Iranians practice politics in the public sphere. Now, the notion of public sphere is something that needs to be defined, but I do want to generally open up this notion of digital public. And how does that change, if at all, our conception of civil society, in particular the Iranian context? Now, let me distinguish three different kinds of publics here. And there was an interesting discussion on Wednesday about the notion of public sphere. Of course, Habermas is famous, Jürgen Habermas is famous for reinventing perhaps the idea of public sphere in the post-war era. But I do want to distinguish these three. One, of course, will be the rational public. This is when I put that in quotation marks because I think rationality has different manifestations and forms. But we're talking about the kind of activism that, originally back in the 18th century Western Europe, you find in coffee houses, saloons, town halls, and I guess in the North American context. The key thinkers, I have that in parentheses, but I really want us to distinguish that from what Gardner calls wild or grotesque publics. I'm thinking of the cultural theorist here, Mikhail Bakhtin, who specifically talks about these kind of activities that are not supposedly quote-unquote rational, but they actually are very much, there's a dialogical component to it. It could be really about ritual events. It could be about street protests sometimes. There's a carnivalesque dimension to these wild publics that sometimes you could regard it to be irrational, but in fact someone like Mikhail Bakhtin and other thinkers would regard it to be very much of a form of a public, a distinct public that is subversive. It flips things upside down, especially authority, flips authority upside down, and is highly parodic. And it happens also sometimes on street level, but it could also happen, of course, in digital or cyberspace as well. The third one, I borrowed that term from Caribbean and Latin American, also post-colonial studies, the idea of camouflage publics. This is a bit complicated, and he hasn't really reached out to the other discourses about the public sphere, but specifically we're talking about contentious performances in the form of invisible strategies of protest. Remember, the idea of a traditional public sphere was that rational debates happen in a public space, which is visible, the agora, the idea of public debate. The camouflage public is completely reversed. It is invisible, it's subtle, it's implicit, but nevertheless is a form of a discourse, is a form of dialogue. It's a form of negotiating with power in very creative and complicated ways. So not all these activities are meant to be quote-unquote political, but they can be interpreted as dissident activities by government authorities. A good example is this one. And this is a water game that happened last summer in Tehran. And this water game, you know, some people decided to have this game in the park, and they decided, this thing, by the way, was organized on Facebook. Interesting note. And when they went to this number of different parks around the city of Tehran, the authorities came and arrested some people, and they banned this whole water games. This is a great example of camouflage publics. I mean, they could be understood as political, but not necessarily, but the state did. Of course, this is a great example of a public, rational public, Majlis is the Iranian parliament. In the Iranian context, of course, make a note, is authoritarian. So the parliament is very much, at least the people who get elected there, it's very limited. There's not much of a rational discourse to begin with in this context, because much of the discourse is limited and sanctioned by higher authorities that transcend the Majlis. This would be a great example of street protests, of course, the Green Movement, and this will be the carnivalesque dimension that comes out of it. This will be a good example of a wild public. And we have those examples, by the way, in American context. Think about the Occupation Wall Street and a number of different ones. I mean, some people have even argued the anti-war movement in the 1960s was a great example of a carnivalesque public, and I would agree with that. Of course, not all carnivalesque publics are necessarily so contentious that they become like street protests, but they can be. And a good example, of course, of this was in the post-election Iranian context, where you have a lot of people using that kind of grotesque language and sometimes violent language and practices to go and fight against the perceived authorities. Now, camouflage performances are different. They mostly pop up after an authoritarian state, especially if a state happens to be authoritarian. Once that state has clamped down on the protesters, especially the carnivalesque public, and also the rational public I mentioned, somehow that public goes quote-unquote underground, and we get the camouflage ones. It happens mostly at night. The best example is the post-election Iran, when thousands of Iranians or protesters would go on the rooftops and they would shout death to the dictator, and that would happen in dark. You could hear the voice, but you couldn't see the people doing it. Daylight, you could find people gathering discreetly in separate groups at various major public spaces, squares, subways, and streets. This also happened right after the election in Iran, especially in subways, where people would get together, organize something in Facebook. They would get together in subways, and suddenly they would start chanting. That is another interesting example of camouflage. You kind of camouflage yourself into the everyday crowd and suddenly pop up. And then the third one are the shadowy spaces. These are the spaces of opaqueness, walls, corner streets, under the lamps, under the phone booths, bridges. This is a good example of the third kind. This is a slogan against Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. Khamenei has lost his religion. He's now the servant of Putin, in reference to the Iranian government being good allies with the Russian government. And this is on the money, Iranian money, and this kind of slogan. This is another one. Marg bar dictator, or death to dictator. Of course, that has been erased. You find this in different walls around the city, various different kind of walls around the city. I would argue that, in fact, the act of erasure, the fact that it has been erased itself, is a form of social protest. And in fact, sometimes that's intended to be the case. Trying to make sure that something like that is erased. V, by the way, is a sign for the Green Movement. I have a number of different pictures I could have showed you, but look at that, the telephone booth underneath it said Mousavi the champion. And then this one, just a week later, it was erased. But what's interesting is that the invisibility itself becomes a visibility in the public. the way in which people would know what's underneath it. In fact, it would make them think even harder about what actually the meaning of that, the content of that slogan is. So these are the kind of everydayness of protest or resistance that I talk about. Now, I want to argue that social media is part of that camouflage public, at least in the Iranian context. At least in the Iranian context. Mousavi, of course, that's the Mousavi's Facebook, the guy that ran against Ahmadinejad, the incumbent president, in 2009. But I want to look at social media in generating a kind of a civic practice in which it is camouflage, but more importantly, it is everyday. It is embedded in daily life because social media is also embedded in daily life. It is discursive. There is a new discursive genre that emerges in the social media, which is again camouflage, but nevertheless is there. The liminal or the fascinating, complicated jokes and gossip and storytellings you find in text messaging, in different emails that are sent. These are all happening in hidden, invisible way. Thirdly is the perceptual, these new different tastes and lifestyles that are also emerging, these behavioral changes, the way people are texting, that they probably would never done it 20 or 30 years ago. Obviously, there were no mobiles back then. So it's creating new social imaginaries for the way people understand the jokes, the contents, the storytelling, but also the other people who are there, that are receiving these different kind of subversive discourses. And that should be number 4, by the way, sorry, the social. And that would be what I don't call this myself. There's another person, 2 other authors actually coined this term, the idea of network individualism. The idea that you have now individuals who are the bridge makers in many times, and they are breaking new ways, creative ways to have or engage in civic activities, and you no longer need the kind of hierarchical organization to do it. But what does that mean? The individuated. I'm not talking about the Republican version of individualism here. We built it, yeah. And of course, I don't mean the romantic version, being isolated and looking at this beautiful mountain. Not at all. This is not a matter of isolationism, people. This is about this book, and I have disagreements with it, but I think it's a fascinating book. It does talk about, I don't know if actually anyone has read this book, but for those who haven't, the authors argue that we are really encountering a new age of network individualism. And by this they mean, like most computer operating system and all mobile systems, the social networking operating system is personal. The individual is at the autonomous center, just as she is reaching out from her computer. It's multi-user, people are interacting with numerous diverse others, and it's also about multitasking. People are doing several things, and multi-threaded. They are doing them more or less simultaneously. Now, you could easily argue that this has been happening for the last few decades. I mean, what is so interestingly new about this? Yeah, I would probably accept that argument. But I do want to say that we are, however, seeing a new kind of agency here. And this work, by the way, this presentation is very much agency-oriented. And it argues that, first of all, there is that aspect of stylization, the way people are expressing voice, the element of voice is centralized. Personalizing politics in ways that probably you could find best in the social networking science. Secondly, we are seeing this intensely engaged with others aspect, this networking dimension that I just talked about. And finally, it's polydirectional, the way in which people are multitasking. And of course, that could be dangerous. I definitely find that very problematic in my classes where my students are checking the email and at the same time listening to my lectures. I know for sure they're not listening to my lectures actually. But anyway, I think what I have in my mind, and ultimately the kind of public sphere that I like to develop here, and what I'm advocating here is a Goffman's public. The kind of public which is about framing presentations in everyday public, but of course this is happening in the camouflage publics, which makes it even more creative. It's also very much happening on a micro level, not much happening in a grander sense that Habermas talked about, or some of the people that have talked about global public sphere, which I very much reject. But this is the new dimension, is also happening in a disembodied face-to-face interactive form. What does that mean? That's a contradiction in terms, isn't it? But I want to argue is that the face-to-face aspect is actually, we should see as a metaphor, more than actual face-to-face. What we are seeing with the so-called new technologies is that people are interacting in disembodied forms, in ways that is creating new forms of interactivity. And finally, those kind of interactivities are increasingly blurring the back and front stage, the way we present ourselves, and of course, the way we are in so-called private lives. A great example, of course, of this is Facebook. I have a family member who likes to report about everything she does in her everyday life. I'm not going to go in details. But Facebook, that's a great example where the backstage somehow crumbles with these new networking sites. And I think there's a lot of potential political activism when it comes to civic activism with that regards. And of course, the issue of identity is central. Now, finally, I'm reaching the end of my talk here. Civil society and social media. I want to argue under authoritarian rule, there's of course an increasing individuated networking as digital media provides, this will be network individuals, with an alternative space to express themselves. So within that context, we have increasing network, this increasing individuated networking, which probably makes it more creative than a country that is so-called democratic. So there's something interesting to note here. And also the kind of civic activism we see here increases as a result, but it will also generate new forms of political activism, as we witnessed in the post-election Iranian case, and of course the so-called Arab Spring. And these new forms of activism, let me get really specific, will be mostly personalized, highly personalized, multi-threaded, and also uncivil, not necessarily civil. This will be talking about wild, grotesque, and camouflage publics. The way people, in an uncivil way, would express themselves on Facebook and also make political comments. This point was actually picked up by Mir Hossein Mousavi, the candidate, right now the opposition movement opposition movement in Iran. I don't know if you want to call him a leader, by the way, that's a different story. But in a very interesting letter, or I think it was actually an email, to Ayatollah Montazeri. This is another dissident cleric who passed away in 2009. He was a very famous guy while he was alive. And in that letter, Mousavi talked about the idea of social networking as a new form of activism. And Mousavi, in another letter, talked about the idea that each activist becomes a campaign center. And that, I think, was a very interesting idea, the way he described it within the Iranian context. And I think that's what I have in my mind when I talk about personalizing civic activism. I think Mousavi was right on target. Well, does that mean that we have to change our idea of civil society, at least the classical version we know, intermediate groups that are organizations, groups that are between the so-called private sphere and the state authority, and that would be the classical one. Of course, there are other different theories. I think so, yes, we should probably rethink it. Should we think about civil networks, perhaps? I don't know. I mean, I'm really very much open to debate here. I'm really willing to hear your opinion on this. I think we are very much seeing the whole discourse of civil society, especially the way it was reinvented in the 70s and 80s, come to new challenges. And one challenge, of course, is the rise of social media and the way people are doing political activities on it. And also the inherent notion of liberalism or the philosophy in civil society, the way it was endorsed at least throughout the 2 or 3 centuries that civil society has become a common notion in our political theoretical discourses. I think on one level, yes, we should reformulate the concept and practice of individualism. We should think about individuals now as what Jean-Luc Nancy calls plural singular. I don't want to bore you with the theory, but basically the idea is that you can be individual among others. Can we rethink about bowling alone amongst others? Different ways of looking at or thinking about social capital in a highly fragmented way, which is at the same time communal? I think so. I think we have to think about it, but there is certainly a way of looking at it. And finally, the idea of secularism. In fact, I would argue with the Arab Spring, we are seeing how civic activism can have very much of a non-secular dimension to it. I don't want to talk about that right now because that would bore the hell out of you. But let's just talk about that in the Q&A section, hopefully. But I do want to say that perhaps what we are seeing in countries like Iran and a number of different Arab countries, and perhaps other societies around the world, is this rise of a post-liberal civil society, which I like to call it the uncivil network society. I would even probably drop out the idea of society at the end of it. If that is the case, How can we rethink the idea of politics or political modernity in the first place? And how could we think or rethink the idea of civic activism on a so-called transnational level? Thank you. Thank you.